I will go to the bank by the wood and become undisguised and naked. I am mad for it, to be in contact with me, the smoke of my own breath, echoes, ripples, buzzed whispers, love root, silk thread, crotch and vine, my respiration and inspiration, the beating of my heart, the passing of blood and air through my lungs, the sniff of green leaves and dry leaves, and of the shore and dark-colored sea rocks, and of hay in the barn, the sound of the belched words of my voice loosed to the eddies of the wind, a few light kisses, a few embraces, a reaching around of arms, the play of shine and shade on the trees as the supple boughs wag, the delight alone, or in the rush of the streets, or along the fields and hillsides, the feeling of health, the full noon trill, the song of me rising from bed and meeting the sun. Have you reckoned 1,000 acres much? Have you reckoned the earth much? Have you practiced so long to learn to read? Have you felt so proud to get at the meaning of poems? Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems.
You shall possess the origin of all poems. That was the very bold promise made in Song of Myself by Walt Whitman. Here was a poet who seemed fully and confidently aware that he was opening a door onto modern poetry. My name is Catherine Merengue. I am co-founder of the Poetry MESA, along with my co-host, the luminous poet Judith Hill. And that opening poem was read for us by the poet Art Goodtimes. Now, in our last Poetry MESA gathering, a night with Pablo Neruda, we presented a man who was deeply indebted to Walt Whitman, like all modern poets. And Neruda understood our collective debt to Walt Whitman. He famously collected copies of Whitman's masterpiece, Leaves of Grass, wherever he traveled in the world, no matter what the cost, including a precious first edition from 1855. In his library, in his home in Valparaiso, he had an enormous portrait of a gray-haired Walt Whitman. And when the room was being redecorated, a workman hanging this enormous portrait asked Pablo Neruda, "Is this your grandfather?" And he said, "Yes."
Yes, yes. Neruda's answer exactly reveals the Dharma lineage of modern poetry rolling forward to us from our shared ancestor, Walt Whitman. What stronger evidence do we have of Whitman's contribution, almost dominance of the DNA turning and twisting through our inherited poetic gene pool? We begin and ever and always come back to Walt Whitman for what we now recognize and understand as the modern voice inside poems, for the enlarging of what subjects are available to us all, and for the huge celebration of self, as in, I am large, I contain multitudes, and Whitman's reinvention, revision, totally new understanding of the music possible to us inside our poems. Also, there's a fantastic ongoing conversation with Whitman across time and space that's been woven by many of our poetry ancestors. And who doesn't love that famous poem by Allen Ginsberg, A Supermarket in California, where Ginsberg speaks directly to Whitman, imagining they're together in a supermarket. And at the end, Ginsberg asks, "Where are we going, Walt Whitman? The doors close in an hour. Which way does your beard point tonight?" And then he says, oh, I just love these lines. "Ah, dear father, graybeard, lonely old courage teacher, What America did you have when Charon quit poling his ferry and you got out on a smoking bank and stood watching the boat disappear on the black waters of Lethe? Or we have the great argumentative poem by Ezra Pound, A Pact, where he finally works out his father figure issues with Whitman. And he says, I make truce with you, Walt Whitman. I have detested you long enough. And he makes his poetry lineage peace by saying beautifully, we have one sap and one root. Let there be commerce between us. Tonight, we are very lucky to have two perfect guests to celebrate and explore this lineage and share in our sheer joy and delight of this original modern poet. We have with us the widely acclaimed poet Mark Doty, National Book Award winning author of more than 10 volumes of poetry and 3 memoirs, and author of the intimate new Lift the Veil memoir, What is the Grass? Walt Whitman in My Life. And we have Zachary Turpin, a dynamic, really fun Whitman scholar who's gained wide acclaim for his recent discovery of Whitman's lost 1852 novella, The Life and Adventures of Jack Engel. Zachary is working on a new book called All Is Not Lost, about long lost literature and the people who devote their lives to discovering it. And we're going to hear about that too.
Our presentation tonight is not going to focus only on Whitman's poetic legacy, which is huge, but on Whitman as a profoundly physical and erotic man and his enduring role as a cultural and sexual icon who wrote very openly on his intimate relationships with men. In honor of this Whitman, this very physical Whitman, we now present to you a short video by Taylor Mack. I think he's a brilliant performer of Whitman's verse, and he does it appropriately dressed in drag. We think Whitman would have adored this performance. So brace yourselves, fasten your seatbelts. This is going to be Walt Whitman as you have never heard him before.
Native moments, when you come upon me. You're here now. Give me now libidinous joys only. Give me life, coarse and rank. Give me the drench of my passions. Today I consort with nature's darlings. Tonight, too. I am for those who believe in loose delights. I share the midnight orgies of young men. I dance with the dancers and drink with the drinkers. The echoes ring with our indecent calls. I pick some low person for my dearest friend. He shall be rude, lawless, illiterate. He shall be one condemned by others for deeds done. I will play a part no longer. Why should I separate myself from my companions? Oh, you shunned persons. I at least do not shun you. I come forthwith in your midst. I will be your poet. I will be more to you than to any of the rest.
Drenched of passions. Wow, wow, wow. How thrilling is that? Whitman by the campfire. And the you can really feel it there for years, hilariously. we feel. Scholars have speculated about Whitman's sexual preferences, where really it seems pretty obvious. And in a desperate desire to prove he was heterosexual, scholars have actually often dredged up a famous letter by one Ellen Eyre, who in 1862 wrote Whitman a provocative letter delivered to him at his favorite haunt in New York City, Pfaff's Saloon on Lower Broadway, down near Bleecker Street, where the poet often gathered with his friends. And in this letter that's supposed to be proof of Whitman's heterosexuality, Ellen Eyre writes, "I fear you took me last night for a female privateer. It is true that I was under false colors, but this flag, I assure you, covered nothing piratical, although I would joyfully have made your heart a captive." And the scholar Ted Genoways, through some very fine detective work, uncovered that Ellen Eyre was actually William Kinney, a female impersonator who lured men to his room, provided sexual favors, and then often blackmailed them. There's no actual evidence that Whitman was blackmailed, but knowing that Ellen Eyre was a cross-dressing man raises some interesting poetry gossip questions, like, was Whitman's interest really in the young woman named Ellen Eyre, or, and this seems more likely, was he drawn to the young man in drag? Taylor Mack brilliantly captured Whitman's sexual openness. I know we all heard that there. And maybe a bit of what must have been his shock value, the sense of experiencing something just absolutely new when people first read that work and when people were first hearing and reading those poems. When we get a taste of Whitman's invigoratingly original and nearly invisible metric, the swing and sing inside this newly minted free verse with this wild, never seen before freedom to ramble, run on, lyrically soar. And we hear, and especially in that last clip, you can hear his love of the common folk, the rush of the streets, and his understanding of large hearts and heroes. Whitman actually pioneered a unique free verse that combines an iambic-ish, short, long, da, da, rhythms with the incantatory repetition that we hear in the Old Testament, instead of using the nice orderly rhymes that we had always heard in poetry up till then. He absolutely disappeared that A-B-A-B or A-B-B-A rhyme scheme, gone. This is a new metric, often throwing out completely the pentameter, which is that, 5 stressed, 5 unstressed that you hear say in all of Shakespeare. Instead, Whitman is a powerhouse of long line music, a new way of saying, an earthiness inspired by the American landscape and the voice of the people. He gave us our poetic freedom in form and in content. In one of his many, many notebooks, which we'll hear about later, Whitman wrote, "I shall not fail to saturate my poems with things substantial, American scenes, climates, names, places, words, every important river and mountain, animals, trees, crops, grains, vegetables, flowers." He wrote of the unimpeachableness of the sentiment of trees. He's a poet of curly language, sprouting alive and spiraling, a poet sprung from the very womb of the earth.
Born in 1819, Whitman's life coincided with a century of social and cultural ferment and the very birthing of the American nation, with all the blood and pain that birthing entails. It was a century that cried out for women's suffrage and the abolition of slavery. It was a time of the first massive waves of immigration. the Industrial Revolution, and of course, the ravages of the US Civil War. Out of this gurgling cauldron, Whitman was a passionate defender of the downtrodden, the poor, the working class, the uneducated, for he himself was entirely without formal education. Listen to this very powerful claim to represent the silenced. Through me, many long, dumb voices, voices of the interminable generations of slaves, voices of prostitutes and of deformed persons, voices of the diseased and the despairing, and of thieves and dwarfs, voices of cycles of preparation and accretion, and of the threads that connect the stars, and of wombs, and of the father stuff, and of the rights of them the others are down upon, of the trivial and flat and foolish and despised, of fog in the air, and beetles rolling balls of dung. Through me, forbidden voices, voices of sexes and lusts, voices veiled, and I remove the veil. Voices indecent, by me clarified and transfigured.
Born in Long Island, New York, Whitman grew up doting on his delicate mother and under the thumb of his passionate and angry father, a financially strapped framer carpenter who was deeply involved with the dissident branch of Quakerism. And all through Whitman, the family's life, his father was struggling to make ends meet. So to help support the family, Whitman quit grammar school at the age of 12. So like the poet William Blake, Whitman had no formal education. And like Blake, he was apprenticed to a printer. Whitman first learned the craft of typesetting at a Long Island newspaper in the era of manually setting metal type. And here we can see what this type looked like alongside a poster that Whitman also typeset to advertise his work. You can just imagine the visceral relationship he had with letters, words, and punctuations, physically arranging the printed word, the white spaces, manually creating the silences inside his poems with his hands. Whitman moved effortlessly from typesetting to journalism, a perfect job for this keen observer of ordinary people and ordinary lives, actually a lover of them, and perpetually taking notes in those famous little notebooks.
Of course, he's best known as the great Civil War poet. I mean, how many of us were forced to memorize, "Oh, Captain, my Captain," when we were in school? Not his best poem, but it was his most popular poem and the only poem that was anthologized in his lifetime. And of course, the war shaped him beyond measure. We will see examples later of the deep empathy that Whitman learned tending the sick and the wounded. But this evening, we're going to focus a little more on Whitman, the poet, in his formation, his earlier years, his inspirations, and the man himself, the sensual, the earthly, the rough or ruffian, as he liked to call himself, disorderly, sensual, eating, breathing, equal with all others, not more, and not a barleycorn less. We are so fortunate to have insight into Whitman's thinking from his voluminous early notebooks and journals. In particular, this marvelous work, Every Hour, Every Atom, a collection of Walt Whitman's early notebooks and fragments, lovingly transcribed and co-edited by our first guest tonight, from the University of Idaho's English department in Moscow, Idaho, the finder of lost Whitman texts, Zachary Turpin. Welcome, Zachary.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Zachary, we're so happy to have you with us. Now, we've read up on you, and so we know that in addition to famously discovering Whitman's lost novella, Life and Adventures of Jack Engel, you also discovered Whitman's unusual wellness manifesto, Manly Health and Training, which he wrote under a pseudonym, in 1858. And we are totally wowed that you hunt down unaccounted for, disappeared, lost works by American women authors like Emma Lazarus, Louisa May Alcott, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. How did you get started as a finder of lost texts?
Well, I think the best word would be organically. I mean, a lot of this work isn't necessarily something that's taught to, say, a graduate student, but it came about. There's somebody famously say gradually and then suddenly, and that's the way it feels to me. As a doctoral candidate, I had read this little note by a Whitman scholar named William White, and the whole note is just a list of Whitman's known pseudonyms. It's the whole thing. It's like this long, and they had such like a sparkling personality to them. They're not only like a schoolmaster or you know who, but also Pomonac, Mose Velser, which ended up being very important, and some other Velser brush, which is constructed from the maiden names of his mother and grandmother. And so not only did those sound very personal to me, but I learned that he had reused them. Like these are things that he kept and held on to. And also they sounded, because I am, I guess, a digital baby in some ways, they sounded like really sharp key phrases to me, the sort of thing where if you entered them into some sort of search engine, they might yield something positive. And so just in an offhanded way, I had entered Mose Velser into a newspaper database, and it came back with this little literary notice that said, almost, it's in huge letters, like a monster truck rally announcement. It says, tomorrow, 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 in the New York Sunday Atlas is an article on manly training by Mose Velser. And I thought, well, that's kind of odd. I've never heard Whitman writing about manly training, whatever that means. So I sent off for some microfilm and forgot about it. And months later, this microfilm arrives and I spool it into the reader. It's the first time I ever touched microfilm, which is a really delightful experience. And what appeared before me was this huge article. And like you said, article after article after article, until it is a book-length work on urban men's wellness by Walt Whitman. It's really a magical moment to know that you are the only living person to be aware of or to see something like that. So that got me started. And I think also I would shout out a scholar named Stephen Ramsey, who wrote this wonderful article called The Hermeneutics of Screwing Around, which is about kind of that very practice of browsing and falling ass backwards into things just by reading non-directively in literary archives. And his example is Frank Zappa reading in a copy of Look magazine about an early electronic composer named Edgard Varese. And he literally read in a copy of Look magazine that the owner of the Sam Goody record chain, if you remember that, had bragged that he could sell obscure records to anyone, including the complete works of Edgard Varese, Volume 1. And so this is how Frank Zappa gets a hold of this really influential artist. So I guess that kind of reading in online archives really speaks to me.
Well, you talk about archives and finding things in long buried dusty archives. We happen to have, that we want to play right now, a recording of Walt Whitman's actual voice from old wax cylinder recordings believed to be made by Thomas Edison in around 1890. The poet is reading just a few lines from his poem, America. And of course, the audio quality back then isn't what it is today. So the audio quality is a little poor. So we are going to show the words on screen as we listen to Walt Whitman's actual voice as he speaks them.
America, center of equal daughters, equal sons, all all alike and dear, grown, ungrown, young or old, strong, ample, fair, enduring, capable, rich, perennial with the earth, with freedom, law, and love.
Doesn't that feel like a miracle? I mean, it's amazing. Whitman is speaking to us from across 200 years. And then the other day when we were talking, you told us fascinating stuff about Daniel Day-Lewis, using that to learn about New York accents.
That's
And
right.
I mean, I love, would you share what you taught us about the rhyme? That was fantastic.
Sure. So that is the only known, as you said, recording of what is almost certainly Walt Whitman's voice. And you may hear as you listen to it that it doesn't sound like a New York accent, as we might, kind of vocalize one today with somebody asking for like coffee or something like that. And the reason, evidently, that linguists would share with us is that the New York accent of the 19th century is much closer to what you would think of as a New England accent, like a Bostonian or even Maine accent today. And you can hear that in Whitman's voice, as well as that wonderful cadence. I mean, he's just, but evidently, Daniel Day-Lewis, when he was preparing for his role as Bill the Butcher in Gangs of New York, he listened to that recording over and over to try to get that kind of intonation into his wording so that he could accurately reflect what a 19th century New Yorker would sound like.
I love that. It's just fascinating to think about how that can come, that's a part of our lives right now. Kind of proves what we've been saying. All right, so yeah, I know it's like our hearts are like, oh, we just got to hear Whitman. So Zach, we also want to hear, of course, about your next book, All Is Not Lost. Love the title. And this book is about lost literature and the people who spend their lives discovering it and devote themselves. Can you tell us more about that?
It is. At first I had kind of conceived of, the more I do this kind of work, which is not random, there's a lot of directiveness to it, even if you are screwing around. The more I realized that the narrative of those who find lost literature is often very similar. You can think about the discovery of Billy Budd, Melville's posthumous novella. You can think about the discovery of like lost Shakespeare plays and things like that. And it kind of gets this Grail-like Indiana Jones equality to it, which is appealing. I mean, I think there's an inherent appeal to that, but that's really not always the way that this goes. So I sort of have two things in mind as I write and as I learn more. One is that not every character who discovers a lost book is savory. So because as humans, we seem to desire this recovery from decay, this recovery from, what is it? The principle where the universe is always descending into chaos. I'm forgetting the word now. Whatever the reason, we seem to want to kind of bring back lost knowledge, or at least seem to have brought back lost knowledge or forge lost knowledge. If you read about the history of, the Gospels, or, I mentioned a lost Shakespeare. There's a fantastic example. This early editor of Shakespeare's named Louis Theobald, and he lived in the era of Alexander Pope. He's the first careful editor of Shakespeare's work. He was also a Shakespeare imitator, and he also discovered a lost Shakespeare play called Double Falsehood, which he claims is co-written and is based on a kind of tableau from Don Quixote. And other readers and Shakespeareans were so suspicious that they basically tore him a new one. He's very famously parodied in Pope's Dunciad as the embodiment of dullness. That's Louis Theobald. There are many Shakespeare scholars today who are convinced that what they now call Cardenio or Double Falsehood is Shakespeare's, but it's almost certainly a forgery. So I'm also interested in thieves and forgers because there's so much priority is given to these great works of lost literature. And the other thing I'm interested in is that this is not a solitary endeavor. Every discovery that I've made, every discovery that other scholars make depends on these chains of interaction. The literary executors who shoveled Whitman's manuscripts into barrels, that matters. The librarians who enter metadata and make sure that something is carefully photographed in OCR, that matters. There are all these little links in the chain, and the discovery is never simple. I mean, even Melville's Billy Budd, Raymond Weaver is the scholar who rediscovered it, but Eleanor Metcalf, Melville's granddaughter, is the one who kept these materials, waiting to give them to someone. So it's these kind of personalities that really interest me.
Yum.
Well, you have the distinction of being a Kluge Fellow at the Library of Congress. And I read that you work to further large-scale engagement in literary research using digital archives. Now, this is so much in keeping with Walt Whitman, who loved libraries, and his spirit of populism, of sharing with the masses, the big us, so to speak. Can you tell us more about this work that you describe as public engagement?
Sure. One of the reasons that I like events like this, and I like speaking to the public in general, is that in keeping with what I just said about how it's not a solitary endeavor, and often I try to make clear that this is no longer an endeavor of privilege. You know, a scholar like me, formally to do this work, would have needed research assistants and TAs and like huge grants and to travel and all of these things. Now, much of this can be done from a computer. And at least the beginnings of this research can lead you through digital archives as well as to physical archives. Two great examples are, one is the Library of Congress's Chronicling America database. It's online. It's tens of millions of newspaper pages from 250 years of American history from all 50 states and some territories. This is my cat, Django. And it's freely searchable by anyone. That database helped me recover one of Whitman's lost works, and I was in my kitchen. So that was the beginning of that journey. The other is the Walt Whitman archive. It's at whitmanarchive.org online. It is all the sort of traces of Whitman, his comet's tail of paperwork, all those things that were shoveled up and put into barrels by his executors and friends and amanuenses. All those were carefully transcribed, recorded, eventually printed or published, and regardless of whether they were or weren't published, are now largely available digitally on the Whitman archive. So it's this like vast digital playground where you can roll up your sleeves and just read all these fascinating little bits of Whitman without necessarily knowing ahead of time what they are or where they lead. And anyone can do that.
Yeah, it's that anyone piece. And I know Walt Whitman and we really love your dedication to the availability and to treasuring that availability to this information. I mean, we've had just so much fun being able to even learn what we've learned to put this together, to talk together tonight about it. So we, of course, Zach, we want to close with hearing you read something from Whitman's notebook, because your book, Every Hour, Every Atom, is really, it's luscious. It is full of such deliciousness, those fragments, everything from little minute pieces of a poem or about to be a poem to just whatever he seemed to be thinking about. I'm figuring you did pore over every handwritten notation too to edit this, yeah?
I did, and so did my co-editor Matt Miller, who had, you know, every bit as much, if not more, of a Herculean task. So it was really something.
So please share from your notebook.
Sure.
Yeah.
So you know, it's very difficult to choose, and I have tons of post-its, but I think I've narrowed it down to two. One is that in more than one of his notebooks, including one called Dick Hunt, which is, they're named for convenience from the first word or words in the notebook, but I think the double entendre is right there because it also has lists long lists of young men and their ages and their physiques. So the Dick Hunt notebook also has games of 20 questions. So these are little notebooks that Whitman stitched together out of scrap paper, and he wrote in them in pencil. And there are games of 20 questions that start just as we would, vegetable, not gritty. It is a wood, manufactured, and you can see him ticking down until eventually he writes at the bottom, bevel. It's a tool that he would have used as a house builder. You can imagine him at a bar or a kind of dining space, like a cafeteria, doing this with a friend, playing 20 questions. It's so humanizing. But the one I'd like to read aloud quickly, if I could, is from a little notebook called Medcaphosis, again, for the first words in it. And it's this moment that's now fairly famous in Whitman scholarship, where Whitman is writing out an idea for a work. And this is what he says in tiny handwriting. He writes, novel, question mark, work of some sort, play, question mark. Instead of sporadic characters, introduce them in large masses. On a far grander scale, armies, 23 fully formed perfect athletes could take characters through the orbs. No one appears on stage singly, but all in huge aggregate. No one speaks alone. Whatever is said by an immense number. You can hear him groping for a genre. Novel, play, lots of people. And then he says, bring in whole races or castes or generations to express themselves. Everything on the most august scale, a leaf of grass with its equal voice. He's finding his conceit, his symbol, the genre, or even building the genre that's capacious enough to say what he has inside to say, and all in this very, very neat, very minuscule handwriting. It would be much smaller. So it's a wonderful book, because you can flip to any page and be bowled over by something that is either soaring and majestic or just beautifully mundane, all crammed together. Thank you.
Oh, God. I mean, just being able to have access to his mind. And that way that for all of us, we have this thought and then that thought and put something together. We so often just get the finished work. This is really a treasure trove of process. What a thing. I'm madly in love with this book. Thank you so much for being with us, Zachary. Your book is hot. How fascinating. We're posting a link for all y'all out there to where you can purchase this book. So if you look in the chat, you will see how to buy Zach's book. So thank you.
Yep, I can't resist adding one of my favorite fragments from the Whitman notebooks that Zachary co-edited is he writes about being at a dinner party with some friends, and Whitman asks his friends, what do you think of my poetry? One of them says, your poetry seems to be full of the raw material of poems, but crude and wanting finish and rhythms. Another friend said, you have too much procreation. Heaven forbid, too much procreation. I think that means sex. It should be noted, Whitman has actually been criticized for viewing women purely in the context of procreation as childbearers and breastfeeders only. D.H. Lawrence thought Whitman viewed women purely in the context of their reproductive function. And indeed, Whitman wrote in a way that was so new, many would have agreed with his friend that it was crude and lacking finish.
Yeah, crude. And I can see why, actually, Catherine, because I mean, I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but poems in English had basically become defined and standardized by the use of that iambic pentameter. So if we have readers who are used to that, these poems would seem obstreperous, rude, wild, unruly. And for myself, I've actually always thought that this was related to landscape. The rhymed, metered form of European poets kind of mirror the formal gardens, the little tidy rows in sequential bloom, little small plots all nicely and tidily walled in. So when I think about a poet for the 1800s, writing poetry in North America, I mean, how do you make a poem that rings with the enormous stretch to mountain horizon that we have in the American landscape? That how do we make a poem that holds and sings to those prairies as far as eyes can see? And at that exact time, the railroad, which is just sort of rivering through the whole continent. Yeah. And I think he really addressed that and kind of solved it by making poems that resound with the all-American sense of the new and the possible, with that sort of mash up and mix of lineage and language. And I could see that the ear of the reader in those days might have been going, oh, crude, no. But I know for us, Whitman is the poet that opened these vistas for us in sound and opened our capacity to see and feel and hold within ourselves and within our poems that wealth, that too muchness, that diversity and divergence and multitude, I am, that vividly mirrors a newly forming nation trying to figure out, who am I?
Exactly. Yeah, when he was a young journalist, he was very opinionated from the very get-go. He spoke out passionately against slavery. And he was, as a result, very often at odds with his employer's views and thought he could get away with writing opinions contrary to those of his editors, like his slave-supporting editor at the Brooklyn Daily Eagle. His strong opinions got him fired from that job in 1848. Among his many firsts, he was the first journalist to write about a new kind of ball game called base. In other words, baseball. What could be more American than being the first journalist to write about baseball? He also worked briefly as an editor of The Crescent, a New Orleans newspaper, where he was appalled to see classified ads in that newspaper of slave owners seeking the return of runaway slaves. Slavery had long been abolished in his native New York, starting in 1827, but slave auctions were still alive and active in Louisiana right through the 1840s. He stayed in New Orleans less than a year, but it left a profound impact. I Sing the Body Electric gives his belief that all people, including slaves, including immigrants, are all part of the great human progression. When Whitman returned to the North, he brought back with him to New York a collection of slave posters, which he kept posted over his desk as a reminder to himself.
And he later described it as a time of simmering, right,
Yes.
for himself, which actually began in 1842 when he heard a speech by Ralph Waldo Emerson, where Emerson lays out his new definition of a poet by describing Walt. And Emerson says, he visits without fear the factory, the railroad, and the wharf. When he lifts his great voice, men gather to him, and immediately the tools of their bench and the riches of their useful arts seem to them weapons of romance. And I know there isn't a poet who can't imagine what it would be like to be ignited by someone describing you that way as a voice of the people and for the people, and really create for yourself, help you even see yourself as the voice, right? That populist voice of America. And then, of course, by 1855, this sensibility, this knowledge, this way of understanding himself as the voice of and for America and her people, this sensibility emerges fully formed in Leaves of Grass, which is a stunning epic poem, yeah, with long, freely flowing lines that go and then crack like a whip way out there, and then start clean with this rhythm that ebbs and rushes like the sea. And he gives us a poem that is a democratic embrace of the rich and the poor and the young and the old and the men and women and sex and birth and death and yeah.
Whitman personally typeset and self-published the first edition of Leaves of Grass in July 1855. Let's take a look now at the cover of this beautiful first edition. Can we take a look? There it is. Whitman designed this book to look unlike any other poetry book. He chose a dark green ribbed Morocco cloth, all of it meant to invoke nature, green, earthy things. The cloth is blind stamped with an overall leafy pattern, and he gold stamped the lush letters of Leaves of Grass. We can take a closer look at the title now. Isn't that amazing? These are letters that mimic trees, sprouting leaves, roots. It's a book whose cover suggests an organic understanding of literature, with words rooted literally in nature, with language abundant as grass. It is thought that Whitman himself designed that beautiful, beautiful title. No author or publisher is named. It would not be until the third edition of Leaves of Grass that Whitman would actually allow his own name to appear on either the cover or the title page. This apparently self-effacing gesture might suggest perhaps he didn't want to elevate himself above the readers he wished to address. But the book did have a famous portrait of the poet on the frontispiece, an engraving from a daguerreotype.
This is really interesting because this isn't just Head and Shoulders. And, you know, back then, most portraits of poets showed them in a three-piece suit with a silk tie and very starched and very clean. And here, Whitman is showing his whole body in work clothes, shirt unbuttoned, with a little curl of chest hair and his sort of hat cocked at a relaxed and yet rakish angle. And the portrait seems to signal to us that the poems are coming from the body as much as the mind. And it's not by accident, but there is that famous shot of his full crotch. And I don't say that to be provocative, because apparently it was quite provocative on Whitman's part. Again, we have the Whitman scholar, Ten Genoese, who recently discovered that there are variations in this engraving, suggesting that Whitman might have worked with an engraver to enhance the bulge of the crotch in the figure. And Catherine found so much hilarious scholarly discourse on this possible bulge. So just for fun, let's take a look at a side-by-side comparison. Yeah, can you see that? It's pretty subtle, but it's very fun. And if you Google Whitman's crotch, believe me, there's quite a lot to read about this. So this sexy visual is echoed in Whitman's first mention of his own name in the book. And halfway through the poem, he says, I make short account of neuters and geldings, and favor men and women fully equipped, and beat the gong of revolt, and stop with fugitives and them that plot and conspire. Walt Whitman, an American, one of the roughs, a cosmos, disorderly, fleshy and sensual, eating, drinking, and breeding. So this bulging crotch version appears in all of the copies in the first edition. Although in later editions, he goes back to the flat crotch, which actually is an interesting thing because it suggests to us that he saw his books as works in progress.
Well, Whitman wasn't shy. He wasn't afraid to boast. And he actually wrote reviews of his own book, Leaves of Grass, and had them published under various pseudonyms using his connections in the publishing industry. He was a one-man PR band, keenly aware of the power of publicity. He manually printed 795 copies of his first edition, and he didn't sell very many. He gave away most of them to his friends. The opening of the book is an extremely long preface, but I'll just read a couple lines from the preface. This is what you shall do. Love the earth and the sun and the animals, despise riches, give alms to everyone that asks, stand up for the stupid and crazy, devote your income and labor to others, hate tyrants, argue not concerning God, have patience and indulgence toward people, take off your hat to nothing known or unknown. Read these leaves in the open air every season of the year. Dismiss whatever insults your own soul, and your flesh shall be a great poem and have the richest fluency, not only in its words, but in the silent lines of the lips and face and between the lashes of your eyes and every motion and joint of your body.
And then he 100% lives up to it. And the poem begins, I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume, you shall assume, for every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spear of summer grass. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health, begin, hoping to cease not till death. His poems are astonishing. They're throaty, they're luscious. The lines slip and slide and wriggle and come back and go forward. And we know, I mean, you can imagine him reading these. He loved and adored theater and opera. And he writes, I hear the trained soprano. She convulses me like the climax of my love grip. The orchestra whirls me wider than Uranus flies. It wrenches unnameable ardors from my breast. It throbs me to gulps of the farthest down horror. It sails me. I dab with bare feet. They are licked by the indolent waves. I am exposed, cut by bitter and poisoned hail, steep amid honeyed morphine, my windpipe squeezed in the fakes of death, let up again to feel the puzzle of puzzles, and that we call being. He's actually kind of redefining what it means to be alive. What is being?
Very presciently, he sent the first copy of Leaves of Grass to Ralph Waldo Emerson, the man who so inspired him to be a new kind of poet. Emerson, to his great credit, became the poet's champion. So he sent him this letter upon receiving the book, this glowing letter from July 21, 1855. The letter reads, Dear Sir, I am not blind to the worth of this wonderful gift of Leaves of Grass. I find it the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed. I greet you at the beginning of a great career. Signed, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Whitman revealed the instincts of a gritty publicist when he printed this entire letter as an appendix to the next edition of Leaves of Grass without actually getting Emerson's permission. He went on to publish a total of 6 editions of Leaves of Grass, the first a very slim volume, but he added to each edition while constantly revising the poems. The first 3 were self-published. He was finally published by Thayer and Eldridge, a Boston publisher, who published the 4th edition. And his final one, assembled in his deathbed, had 359 poems.
Yeah, I mean, it goes with, I celebrate myself. I mean, this is that largesse, but we can also feel that enormous generosity. And it's all through the book, that love and the deep connection he felt with working people. And we know from everything we read about him that he expressed this also in actions. This was his life, not just his words. He was known for helping stagecoach drivers who at the time would often fall from their coach and get injured in the street. Whitman would step in and he'd finish their routes and he'd give all the money he collected to the drivers' families. And then he would actually go and visit the drivers in the hospitals. And it's believed that these experiences later led the way for him going to hospitals to take care of the injured soldiers during the Civil War, which is his very, very famous work. During the Civil War, Whitman served as a volunteer nurse and wound dresser, and he gave it his whole heart. The stories of this are just so touching and really, really beautiful. This social activism that was part of really who he was, not just the poems. He would gather all kinds, whatever money he could, and he'd buy ice cream and brandy and oysters, peaches, pens, writing paper, socks, and clothes. And he would sit for hours bedside, often staying up all night with the amputees, and he would read and write letters for them. And he actually then also wrote about this in these lines from the poem, The Wound Dresser. Bearing the bandages, water, and sponge, straight and swift, to my wounded I go, where they lie on the ground after the battle brought in, where their priceless blood reddens the grass, the ground. It's absolutely, it just makes my heart explode with joy to know that this legacy is really also there for us, that the words we put in the world knit into the way we behave and the way we show compassion to each other in our work and in our life. He ends this poem by saying, to each and all, one after another, I draw near, not one do I miss. An attendant follows, holding a tray. He carries a refuse pail, soon to be filled with clotted rags and blood, emptied and filled again. And this sensitivity, this grace, this generosity, this holding a mirror to what the culture doesn't want to see, well, that's become the way of the poet, and it's our inheritance from Walt Whitman.
Well, oddly, that poem, The Wound Dresser, was criticized by the great author Henry James, who thought images like blood-soaked rags and a refuse pail were not appropriate for a poem. Whitman changed forever what we could say in verse. He uses language to shake up and awaken the reader to discrimination, bigotry, thoughtless acts. We inherit from Whitman this radical passion for human rights, paving the way for all the great political and social movements of the last century and a half. Feminism, anti-racism, environmentalism, anti-war movements. We also inherit from Whitman the pantheon of current modern day poets. And this brings us to our final guest, the extraordinary poet, often compared to Whitman himself, a further link in Whitman's long DNA chain, Mark Doty. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. You've done a wonderful job of introducing Walt Whitman to your audience. I'm very impressed with that presentation that you've just spoken.
Oh, thank you. We learned so much I learned so much I didn't know. And it's such an honor to have you here. You know, we'd love to talk about your book, What is the Grass? Walt Whitman in My Life by Mark Doty. Let's show the book on the screen. And of course, as always, we'll have a link to where you can find this book in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. Now, I'm generally not one to believe everything I read on book covers, but I really think that this blurb on your book happens to be true. What is the grass doesn't possess a single inelegant sentence or poorly expressed thought. That from the Washington Post. It's such an extraordinary book that combines a memoir of your life wrapped around your biography of Whitman and your observations on his poetry and his impact on our culture, especially queer culture. It's really such a joy to read. And I earmarked my book with a few Post-it notes of things I'd love to ask you about and won't have time to. But tell me, what inspired this unusual format that's cross-genre, memoir, biography, critique? Where did that come from, and why did you choose to write this book?
Well, I knew that I wanted to speak back to Walt Whitman. And I think that's inevitable when something moves us so profoundly and we're in awe at the accomplishment of an artist. There's an urge to talk to that artist or to talk about that artist, to give something in response. I had been to Walt Whitman's house in Camden, New Jersey. And it was a disappointment, really, because there were many kinds of, menus from testimonial dinners and sort of honorary objects for the grand old man of poetry. And nothing seemed to quite connect until I saw on a high shelf his stuffed parrot. It was, maybe it was a little parrot, maybe a canoe. It was deep, sort of emerald green, a little bit ratty and moth-eaten, but there were its glass eyes still intact. And I looked at that bird and I knew it had sat upon Walt Whitman's shoulder. The bird used to sit on his shoulder when he read his mail. And something happened that he became human to me in a way that had never before really been true. It's in awe of this character and puzzled by him. And suddenly he became a breathing person to me. So that was first. I wanted to make a book that was not just another work of literary criticism, which is a genre I love, but there are shelves and shelves of books in which much ink has been spilled describing Whitman and his poetry. And often they don't lay claim to a particular perspective, or they're not honest about their perspective. I wanted to position myself as a reader who has very specific things in mind and interest and preferences and interests. And Whitman's poems have been a lens through which I see my own life. So if I was going to talk about him, I needed to talk about myself. And I wanted to write a book that no one else could have written, which would be the most personal book about Whitman I could write. The problem I discovered in a while was how to connect my life with his. How could I do that in a way that didn't seem hubristic or self-aggrandizing? How do I manage to put myself next to Walt? Well, through questions, through associations, through looking very closely at the poems and thinking about the ways they resonated for me in my own experience. It's a great place to find yourself. We can all find something of ourselves in those poems.
It's intimate and it's such a fresh way for us to learn both about Whitman and about you, a modern American poet who is also a voice that'll be carrying forward for other poets. I mean, you're carrying your own lineage too, Mark.
Thank you very much. There were many times that I thought about just putting that book away. It stalled about 3 times and took a long time to finish. And once I had a voice for it, then I could write the book. Once I had a sort of a through line, I could see my way towards completing it. But it was a long haul.
It took courage too, yes? Because it's intimate.
It's intimate. There's a lot of self-examination in that book. It's quite open about sexuality because I wanted to be able to say things that Walt Whitman could not say about himself. So I had great pleasure in trying to imagine my way into his life and into more intimate aspects of his life.
It's a gift to all poets to watch that dance that you and he do. Something that I was thinking about was when we hear that title, Song of Myself, we might think that that's self-centered or egotistical. But the poem, as you point out to us, is suffused and infused with longing for the one thing that isn't myself, it's you. And I love this so much. You reveal that the word you is the single most repeated word in Whitman's work. And you quote this particular very sweet, sort of, you can feel it being whispered in someone's ear, this passage, this hour I tell things in confidence. I might not tell everybody, but I will tell you.
And of course, that line is wonderfully ironic too, right? Because he is everybody, but he wants to draw everybody into his poem.
Everybody is his you.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know of any other poet who works so hard to call his audience into being and to try to push past whatever might be between them. He gets tired, he says, of paper and ink. He wants to reach to the page because he wants so much to connect with his readers and really to create an audience which largely did not exist. You mentioned his 790 copies of the first edition of Leaves of Grass. We don't know that he sold even one of them.
He's the Van Gogh of poets.
And then a year later, he publishes the second edition. I mean,
Oh, he didn't give up. But this notion of reaching to the you, it's probably the most famous in his poem Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, where he very radically connects the poet's time with future generation, reaching out and kind of snatching the future reader by the scruff of the neck across time and space. He writes, "It avails not, neither time or place, distance avails not. I am with you, you men and women of a generation or ever so many generations since. I project myself, also I return. I am with you and know how it is." I mean, tell us what your reaction to that incredible.
Worry in that voice, which is saying something impossible, essentially. I see the future. I see you in the future who will be reading my poem. And I know that you will then look back to me as I look forward to you. So he is extending himself in time in the most remarkable way. He says, you were part of a living crowd. I was one of the crowd. And when he wrote that, he was about 36. But he aligns himself with the dead. I was one of a crowd. And here I am now, a voice which I have fastened to the page, a voice which will hold who I am and what I've seen and what I believe forever, essentially, as long as people read poems. And it's, what he's doing is telling the truth that, 200 years later, we're reading that poem. And it is mattering with great intensity. I, in fact, just read a good chunk of it aloud a couple of nights ago at an event. And I could feel his conviction coming through me and, in fact, convincing the audience. So he says, it is accomplished, is it not? What the teaching could not accomplish has been accomplished, hasn't it? What the words cannot say has been said. It's a remarkable poem and right up there with the strangest poems that our country has ever produced. This prediction of the future that we feel a poet from the past is with us at this moment, watching us and handing us his poem, his words.
He really has tremendous command of sort of micro, and then macro, like he's standing somewhere on Mars looking at the entire galaxy, and then he's looking at the sphere of the green leaf. And that capability is really pretty extraordinary. I have to ask you about something that I completely adored, another one of my favorite sections, where you write about Whitman's use of blank space on the page as an active force. And Catherine and I were talking about this, and we're wondering, do you feel that this is because Whitman laid out the type himself, and that might be connected to his command of white space and silence?
I think it's certainly related. Before his work in free verse, stanzas were determined by patterns, right? That were predetermined. So you might have couplets, you might have tercets, you might have quatrains, and those stanzas had a particular role to play. And we knew when we saw them that that's what would come next. So the stanza break there is really just kind of white space. It's just an interval, and nothing is as much happening in it. We're waiting to get to the next bit. If you were listening to that poem, you might not even know there were stanzas. In Whitman's case, and you really feel this at the beginning of Song of Myself, when he is careful, the printer in Whitman is carefully fastening those words to the page. He's placing a line here, white space, another line. But what happens is that one stanza, he's considering an idea, he's wondering about something, he thinks about it, and then something else begins. So, great example. A child said, "What is the grass?" Fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. White space. It is the flag of my own disposition, of hopeful green stuff woven. White space. And he then proposes another thing the grass might be. So those spaces are places where thinking is taking place, and we're moving to the next assertion. And this makes the stanza alive. It makes that white space crackle and organize his poem in a profoundly new way. Originally, that long poem, 65 pages, of Song of Myself, had no sections. It just continued. And you can imagine what it would be like to read that thing with no starting and stopping places. It took him about a dozen years to realize that, well, breaks really help. And when he added them, we get the wonderful addition of a final line, such as the last line of that section, which is, "And to die is different than anyone had supposed, and luckier." White space. And that "and luckier" just resonates in the air until he begins the next section. So he learned something about the power of pauses in art. across that time. He really was a remarkable editor and shaper of his own work, not always for the best. He made real mistakes in his revisions. He was never an even poet. He was a person who took risks and great experiments, and sometimes really blew it, and other times made the most remarkable poems of his century, I believe.
That
It's
transparency.
hard to,
Sorry, Catherine, go on.
it's just hard to imagine he could have done that work with those breaks if he didn't actually physically lay the type on a page.
Yes.
I actually learned a printer's term from your book. When printers create dummy pages with nonsense text just to test a layout, they call the pages grass. And it just struck me that maybe that's a little private joke
I think
that
so.
he's sharing with printers, leaves of grass.
I'm just making something, I'm tossing this off. This is offhand. And he wants to preserve that kind of offhand, friendly attitude. You know, I loaf and invite my soul, or you know, loaf with me on the grass. It's a very casual voice that has the most crucial things about being alive, about being human, about life and death, about love, about community to say. And yet it's offered in this very casual, friendly attitude. You know, there's a poem, I think it's Song of the Open Road, where he says, shoulder your duds and come with me. Now, what other poet would say, shoulder your duds? It's as casual and as cool as possible. And that points to one of his achievements, which is to import a lot of American speech and language onto the page. No poet before Walt Whitman had written a poem with the phrase shoulder your duds in it. And lots of other stuff that he brings in names of places, Native American words, words for industry, science, technology, so much new stuff happening. So he was writing at a moment when our language was just exploding, as was his city. You know, New York is burgeoning, it's reaching in all kinds of directions. And he's about as brash and as much of a salesman and as much of a self-promoter as any New Yorker could ever be. Citizen of his city.
I'm also really, I can imagine that he also dealt with a lot of censorship. And when you read about him, you read about the different times that, you know, there were all sorts of, he had that boss that fired him when he found leaves of grass in his desk. And even Emerson, right, asked him to cut out the more blatantly sexual poems.
And became a real star in England because an edition of selected poems was published with the really salacious ones left out. And it seems to really help his reputation. So yes, but it's odd, you know, that what people were always complaining about were his representations of heterosexual sex. Not of, as you were saying earlier, that, you know, the same-sex love that is just all over the place in those poems. It seems as if you didn't know it was there, you didn't see it. So readers seem to mostly just gloss over that and go on to be startled by something else, except of course for people who shared Whitman's experience. So there's a kind of code speech. There was one of the first reviews talks about the sin by a dreadful man named Rufus Griswold. He says in his review that these poems touch upon the sin that is not to be named among Christians, which is sodomy. But he said that in New York Examiner, New York Herald, something like that, in Latin. And I think, who read that? So is he telling people who are interested in that sin, go read these poems? Or is he advertising them? Or is he warning us away from them? Hard to tell.
Oh, gosh. But he did often edit and sanitize his own poems himself. In Calamus 24, he writes in a handwritten early version, I dreamed in a dream of a city where all men were like brothers. I saw them tenderly love each other. I saw them in numbers, walking hand in hand. I dreamed this was the city of robust friends. Nothing was greater than manly love. But then he softened that later and took out manly love and replaced it with robust love, which you said in the book was brilliant.
It's very smart, but you know, it's not an impact. I think that he was so daring to say what he said. And if he had gone very much further, I don't think we would have ever seen those poems. I think they were essentially, the really forthright, clear poems of Whitman's were only readable to a very small group when he wrote them. And they become scrutable later. But what happens when you say something that's so outside the definitions and understandings of your culture that nobody's going to get it? He's writing, again, it's another way he's speaking into the future. He believes that city will come and that readers like himself will appear, but he understands he's got to somehow arch the poems into the future to make that happen. There are some very forthright love poems. Some of the Kalamazoo poems are really quite direct.
Visceral, visceral, visceral. Yeah.
One that amazes me is a poem where he says, I'm sick of being the poet of these states. I'm not going to sing about Kansas and Ohio and the West and so on anymore because I've found a man who really loves me. He abandons his career in that poem. And then in the next Kalamazoo poem, picks it back up again. He cut that poem from the second publication of the sequence. And you can see why, because he's just voided his whole project in the name of love. There's nowhere to go from there. So he's just hide that and go on.
Well, I love having that as my dowry. That really works for us. Well, I am so sorry that we have run the clock because honestly, we could listen to you and Zach for hours.
This is a delight. I love talking about him, and it's a sort of contagious pleasure, I think, to think about this amazing, mysterious, and entertaining man.
And Mark, you bring him forward in such a personal way. We can feel your passion for him.
Thank you.
So
he's an heroic figure, if ever there was one.
Well, I'm going to make a request. Would you end this incredible conversation by reading one of all of our favorite poem sections, the final poem from Song of Myself, which perfectly ends with that all-important word, you.
This is after the great spiraling of that poem where the speaker has gone in search of himself, in search of the other, in which self and other have blurred so completely. And he arrives here. The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my gab and my loitering. I too am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yawp over the roofs of the world. The last scud of day holds back for me. It flings my likeness after the rest, and true as any, on the shadowed wilds, it coaxes me to the vapor and the dusk. I depart as air. I shake my white locks at the runaway sun. I effuse my flesh in eddies and drift in lacy jags. I bequeath myself to the dirt, to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You will hardly know who I am or what I meant, but I shall be good health to you nevertheless, and fiber and filter your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere, waiting for you.
Oh. And I feel absolutely greeted and waited for by that majestic voice. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you, Mark Doty. Thank you, Zachary Turpin. Thank you, Catherine Morengi. Such beautiful, amazing conversation that we were able to have here tonight. And thank you, our good times, for that ebullient, magnificent opening reading. And of course, we give enormous thanks, hugs, love, and applause to Tina Vika and Patty Garcia, our brilliant production team. And as ever, we thank the San Miguel Literary Sala for hosting us. So, Catherine, want to take us on out, sister?
Thank you. Thank you all. And we're going to close with just a closing screen from the lines from the poem that Mark just read are actually on his epitaph, on his gravestone. So we're going to close with a picture of Walt with his boyfriend and words from that epitaph. So thank you all, and have a good night.